Get out of here.
Well, I am talking to you from the shores of the North Saskatchewan River right here in scenic Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. And this is Do You Know Jack radio show slash podcast. And on the line with me, I have accomplished rock critic and now author of fiction. I am talking about the man, the myth, the legend himself, Robert Duncan, who is here today to promote his book, Loudmouth. How are you doing, my friend?
Well, I'm doing great. It's in a heat wave with wildfires all around us and the plague. I'm doing great. I can't complain.
Yeah, well, no kidding, no kidding. Now, like with journalism, though, I mean, like you can probably stay fairly sane and sheltered in place or whatever the word of choice is out in Cali. But I mean, from a musician perspective, though, apart from new releases, how much can you actually cover, right?
Disaster. Yeah. Well, I mean, I just feel bad for the musicians, I mean,
Yeah,
though I'm enjoying some of the virtual shows. I mean,
right.
and I tip. I go to PayPal and I put money in there for the musicians. But
Yeah,
yeah, interviewing musicians. I mean, I'm not. I don't do a ton of that anymore. I've been working on this book for years,
right.
and just doing other stuff, but keep
Yeah,
my
for
hand.
sure. I definitely want to get to the book, obviously, because I mean that's the reason why you're here with
Oh,
me
I'm not pushing
today.
it. I'm not.
But
I'm not a.
I
Whatever
was
you
just
want to talk about.
Well, I was just gonna say now I'm glad you mentioned virtual shows because I mean being a veteran of somebody who has probably seen thousands upon thousands of shows, I would imagine at this point after like 5 decades in the business. Um what I noticed about virtual shows at first were like musicians were just sort of going on to different social media platforms and just kind of doing it to stay sane and basically offering it for free. But
Yeah.
now that the quote unquote plague has gone on as long as it has, we're seeing this seismic shift where there's either virtual tip jars or artists just straight up saying $10 will get you in and we'll be actually performing and recording at this venue. I mean, do
Right.
you think artists gave it up for free too much too soon?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I think you had to get people to try it, and
Yeah,
when you try it, there's for certain artists at a certain moment, it's like, wow, that's cool. There's a guy named Elliot Murphy. I mentioned him in the novel, but
right.
and he was kind of a New Dylan type figure in the early '70s, and he's been living in. He never kind of took off in the States, and he's been living in France for forever, and. And, one day I see, hey, Elliot Murphy's going live. And I'm thinking, all right, damn it, I haven't seen Elliot Murphy in 40 years. And so he's a much bigger deal over in France than he ever was. He's like those jazz musicians that kind of it took off for him over there.
Yeah,
But and it was kind of cool to see Elliot Murphy in his living room, playing a few songs, so that kind of turned me on. And then we have some musician friends. They're like mostly jazz players, and they every Saturday night they always play in this Italian restaurant we often go to on a Saturday night.
right, right.
This wacky thing. I've been writing a blog about it for the last few years because it's so
I
wacky.
noticed that.
But these folks who play there every Saturday night, they can't do that. So they've been playing. They play at their house, and we go get food from the restaurant, takeout food, and we sit and we have them on next to us at the table. So I like that. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
the same, but still. And you know, well, what we do is we pick up takeout food, and we also pick up takeout food for a bunch of our broadcast musician friends who we do a few deliveries and then we go home and listen, uh, and because they're really hurt.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we were talking before I started to record too about how now live shows are coming back in that socially distanced manner and there's drive-in shows that are
Right.
starting to happen. I mean, that's an interesting development in and of itself.
Yeah, that the Blue Oyster Cult show, um, it had a real stage, big tall stage. I mean, it looked like any outdoor stadium show, and it
Yeah.
had big video screens on either side. So it was like a real promoter had done it. It just the audience was all in cars, or actually a lot of them were standing outside their cars, I noticed. But
Yeah.
still, it looked great.
Well, I was thinking now, like, there's venues now that are actually opening, but of course people can't come inside yet because of the various restrictions. Like, um, I've heard from a few people, like hockey season and playoffs, for instance, recently came back. But there's no crowds in these bubble stadiums, right? But I've heard people say, "Oh, hey, I actually kind of like watching hockey without all of the people around." And maybe that's just a generational thing, like, getting out
Or-
and sweating it out in the pit and getting,
Yeah,
accidentally spat on, and, all of that
yeah.
stuff. Like, that seems to be the appeal of going to a lot of shows,
But
having those
yeah,
crowds.
I think it's just the novelty. I cannot imagine that a game is actually, the hockey match is actually better without a crowd.
Yeah.
I'm not a big sports fan, but I remember the first time I went when I lived in Detroit working for Cream, and I went to see the Detroit Pistons basketball team, and I couldn't believe the energy in the room, and people being very funny and very inventive and just totally into it.
Yeah.
And when everybody goes back to games and shows again, it'll be like, oh right, you can make do, but this is much better.
It's really awkward watching some things like professional wrestling, for instance. I watched a clip with no crowd, and I was like, this isn't even like remotely interesting to watch without people, like, burping and
True.
farting and like yelling insults and holding like stupid signs and stuff. Like, it kind of,
That's part of the game. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. Well,
well,
now I was going to mention, obviously, the book Loudmouth is, you're getting ready to release, is that even the right way of putting it?
yeah, I
October
think,
October 6th, your book, your work of
yeah,
fiction comes
right.
out.
Lightly
Um,
veiled, lightly veiled fiction. It's available for pre-order now at all just everywhere, and it'll be in bookstores everywhere.
yeah.
Uh, on October 6th, but right now it's available for pre-order. If the audience smokes a lot of pot and forgets things, you could just go right now.
Yeah, well, and I was gonna say it's Three Rooms Press too, is
Yeah,
the publisher.
yeah,
October 6th is the official release date. Now I guess, just the softball question would be, you've written works of nonfiction, and that's kind of been your ballpark, to use the sports metaphor, up until now. What took you so long to like cross over into the world of fiction? And given the subject matter that you're covering, is this work even fiction at all?
yeah. Well, those are two good questions, and the answer to the first, the nonfiction, is, when I was younger and I had to depend on my journalism just as for my living to pay the rent, and it often didn't do that. You don't make a lot of money when you're a rock critic, and so there was not a chance in hell I was going to sell a novel, or for even a reasonable amount of money. So I had to focus on nonfiction things where the publishing industry could process what it was, and knew where to slot it, and knew how to promote it. And not that they did promote it, but so so that kind of, I had started out wanting to be a novelist. That's what I thought. Oh, I'll write a nonfiction book and then I'll write a novel. But well, that wasn't really the way the industry seemed to work. Um, and uh, I just needed to. I couldn't take 5 or 6 years on a book as I did on this one. I needed to get some things out there, and again, buy groceries, pay the rent. And then when I had my first kid, uh, I had to make enough money to support a kid.
Hmm.
So I went and did other things like copywriting to make money. And so I always thought, well, I'll circle back to doing a novel, which was my initial intention. Uh, it was my initial intention after I left bands, because I wanted to be a rock star. and started pursuing that at like the age of 12. But when I, after many years of copywriting and non-novel stuff, I decided, hey, well, it became clear that here's the time, let's do it now.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, now,
and then your second question, yes,
well, yeah,
it is a novel, but it's, I have said my lazy description is a veiled memoir, and but you couldn't take any of it as actual documentary fact. I would say that I've told people the most outrageous stuff. People will ask me, the advanced reviewers will say, "Well, you just got to tell me, is that true?" And I go, "Look, here's a rule of thumb: the things that are really outrageous, that's the true stuff, and the kind of the other stuff, that's connective tissue."
yeah, yeah.
So
You kind of split the book into two parts too. I mean, there's sort of this troubled youthful upbringing that leads you to the rebellious spirit of rock and roll, and then it
yeah,
sort of bridges from that into your I shouldn't say you, but your protagonist,
yeah.
Thomas Ransom's a transition from the family life into the the rock and roll lifestyle. I mean, like, was that sort of done by design? Like, were you building that character so that you could have that ultimate rock and roll payoff towards the end?
Well, building suggests that there might have been an architect or an engineer behind it, and I was just writing, and I started just on a writing jag six years ago, and I didn't know what I was writing, but I was writing a lot, and it seemed to be some sort of therapeutic thing, and just completely compulsive, and at the end of that, I said, well, what is all this stuff I've been writing? And a lot of it was stories from my childhood or my teenagehood or later. And I thought, gosh, this, if you put these together in a certain way, they could kind of be a book. And so then I started doing that, cutting stuff out, putting new stuff in, and writing more. That's when I became more kind of plan oriented, and and that's what happened. So did I set up the character? I mean, as I was going, again, I didn't know when I first started writing all this stuff, it might have been a memoir, or it might have been, I didn't. So at some point I decided, okay, this kind of memoir-y stuff, I'm going to make this a novel. And I did that so I didn't have to ever look over my shoulder at the facts gaining on me, or people saying, "Hey, that wasn't the way that was," or it wasn't that guy. And it's like, well, this is how I remember it, or it's how I want to remember it, or
Mm-hmm.
I like telling stories in bars, and I don't think I've ever told a true story in a bar. You're always embellishing and editing and all that stuff. So it's kind of a 250-page bar story. You know.
Now, part of the allure of this book, though, is your characters, Thomas Ransom's, ability to get to know some of the interesting characters in that Detroit scene, and also, of course, in New York City. One of the probably more fascinating stories that I found was, and you just touched on it for a very short period of time, but the writing of the Kiss book, which
Yeah.
you yourself wrote that Kiss autobiography.
Yeah.
And I've been wondering about that ever since that information dropped in my lap. I mean, like, now, what is this? I read some of the Kiss book, and the way you are describing some of the songs, in particular on the first record. I'm sure you've seen this bad boy many times before.
Yeah.
I mean, the way you talk about the song Firehouse, it sounds like you're describing Mozart. Like, like, what is? I laughed. I'm a lifelong Kiss fan. I can't help it. I don't know if I should apologize to you or what, but what was going on there?
Well, they've meant a lot to me. It's funny. I had an eye accident last week, so I had to go to the ophthalmologist just before this, and I'm wearing my hotter than hell Vans, and
Nice.
the nurse goes, "Is that Kiss on your shoes?" oh, that's so cool. So, weird shit happens. So they've obviously meant a lot to me. Often when I wrote about them and talked about them, is often tongue in cheek, because I was really young when I started writing. And when I was editor at Cream, I was 22. But and when I wrote the Kiss book, I was 23. So, but I was just old enough to not be entirely taken in by the whole showbiz aspects of it. And uh and yes. So when I was writing the book, um I haven't read it in a while, though I did a reissue of it a few years back, and wrote a new intro, which forced me to read some of it, because I'm always embarrassed by the stuff I've written in the past. And uh and I yeah, I like to write. I like to write a combination of high and low. So that's where I have fun, you know, creating these flights of pseudo poetry, and then kind of bringing them back to earth with something simple and crude. So yeah. So you're talking about the flights of poetry. Eventually it comes to earth in a some crude statement.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I would have had a chance to, it's hard. It's a hard book to find, from what I understand, even with the reissue. But I mean, you
Oh no, the
know,
reissue is there. It's Amazon. You can look it up.
is it really? Wow. I mean,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
did look on Amazon.ca, and it was one of those, shady private, people trying to hawk. And I don't know if it was an original copy or a reissue. But yeah, I mean, this is a book
yeah.
now that I need to check out in full. I just kind of was like, oh, that's a really interesting review of some of their songs on their first album. And you had them in 1978.
Yeah,
It was kind of like they had accomplished all of those massive heights,
yeah,
but they were kind of teetering on the brink at that point. And I would
yeah.
imagine that you, as a journalist, probably could also see that, coming a mile away, as probably the rest of the rock and roll, intelligentsia of the time.
Yeah, it seemed like was going to be a short arc, and it felt like, all right, when the 4 solo albums came out, it seemed like, all right, well, that now it's just crashed, uh, because we were hearing that the solo albums. I remember the quote was shipped platinum and returned double platinum, and I mean, obviously that's not possible, but it was kind of, it seemed like, all right, they're trying too hard, they're reaching too far, they've thinned out the brand too much, and I don't know. In the end, I guess those solo albums did all right. I mean, something like Ace's solo album did well, because he had that New York uh,
New York Groove.
New York Groove, which was a hit. Um, but I think they probably were a disappointment, or that's what I heard. So I don't
I
know.
think Jeans did okay too.
Yeah,
I know oftentimes people say Peter's solo record is like the worst of all of the, the Kiss releases, at least ones that are considered part of the canon, so to speak.
yeah, the canon. You sound like you're talking about Mozart now.
Well, I mean, here's the thing, right? Like, I'm Generation X, so like the metal years were kind of like my, early teens.
Yeah,
And like, it was my generation that fell for that kind of late, heavy Kiss merchandise, and the lunch kits and the Dynasty era pomp and circumstance.
yeah,
And now, 40 years later, here we are, right? Like, the band is still has that multi-generational appeal, and it's probably seemed ridiculous at the time for somebody that was seeing them come up in that first generation, what they're making lunch kits now. But they've been able to last almost 50 years, probably because they did that. Because now I'm introducing Kiss to my own kids, and I
yeah,
mean, who knows if they'll introduce it to their kids. But I mean, 3
yeah.
generations is pretty impressive for any band, right?
Yeah, it reminds. I mean, the band that first just changed my life was the Beatles, because I came up in that era,
Right.
and I was a 12-year-old when the Beatles played on Ed Sullivan, or maybe I was 11, And it was like, all right, that's it. And then the British invasion happened just to reinforce all that with, the Stones and the Kinks and the Yardbirds and all these really, I mean, they really were wonderful bands. But, so maybe the Kiss are the Beatles of the 70s.
Oh my God. Oh my God. I've heard that argued before. I've tried to argue that myself. But
Oh,
you've been critical of heavy metal over the years, right? I mean, like the Cream
yeah,
magazine seemed to be more, into the punk thing, and bands from Detroit like MC5 and the Stooges. But I mean, in a way, when the '70s ended, metal kind of came around. And to quote Tenacious D, punk tried to kill the metal, but it was thrown down, right? Like,
right.
I mean, as somebody that saw that happening, I mean, what's your opinion there?
Well, Cream was big on metal, even when I was there, which was mid '70s. The kind of early metal of Black Sabbath and I don't know if you want to have Led Zeppelin spans metal, but it does. Uh, Black Sabbath and our friends the Blue Oyster Cult. Uh, I think there was let's see, Deep Purple. I mean, all those bands. Um, so I think Cream was into metal and then transitioned into punk. In fact, I think Cream probably was, a hair late on getting into punk. They weren't in the vanguard of it, as they should have been because of Iggy Pop, the kind of the proto punk of all proto punks, was the hometown boy, and he would come by the Cream office sometimes. So, but and a lot of stuff I wrote and a lot of stuff that was written at Cream was in part written for just for entertainment, in part for the writer's entertainment, and in part for the audience's entertainment. I mean, the idea would be to make people laugh. For me, I found it difficult to make it something that's like, okay, this is not a life and death issue, so we can have some fun with it.
Yeah.
So yes, I'd write something negative about heavy metal. I mean, I've told the story about uh, when I was first writing about Kiss. I had left Cream and I was freelancing, and I realized, God damn, I could sell a Kiss story, and that would help pay the rent. And so I wrote for every music magazine there was, and I would do stuff like, write a negative article one week, and I would write a positive article the next week in a different magazine. And then I would just do that oscillation it just went on forever. And I remember thinking, God, if there's somebody who gets all these magazines, that to me was hilarious. That they'd wonder what was wrong with me, or they'd get the joke. And there were some people who got the joke.
Yeah.
I'd hear from them from time to time. So, I was having fun, and I was making fun of the critical establishment, and there was developing at that time a critical establishment. Rolling Stone had gone pretty straight and square in a rock and roll way, and in fact, they'd gone into Hollywood movies and all this crap, and they'd have actors on the cover. And I remember the first time, I can't remember what actor it was, but that I saw, a Hollywood actor on the cover of Rolling Stone. I thought, okay, well that's it. And so I was always having fun. So even when I was making fun of heavy metal, I was, there was some heavy metal. I wasn't a huge heavy metal fan, but there
Yeah.
was some I quite liked. So
That's fair. That's fair.
I went on my wife and I went on our honeymoon on tour with the Blue Oyster Cult, but
I
in
love
Europe.
that band. Yeah, it would be nice to see Joe and Albert get back with those guys again and just
Yeah,
reunite that original lineup. And I don't know enough about the split to even know if that's even a distinct possibility. But I
they
mean,
came back when they did a 40th anniversary show in New York. Oh, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. They came and played a few songs, and I think Albert. I saw Albert. I don't know, earlier this year, and he's quite happy. He went on to become a teacher.
oh
He
nice.
teaches music in a high school in New York, and he was Obama's last year. That was it. He got one of these you know, Teacher of the Year awards, national. He was among the 100 teachers they brought in from across the country as here's the 100 best teachers of the year.
Wow.
And one of them was Albert Bouchard, former drummer for Blue Oyster Cult, and one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet.
Yeah. Yeah, I've talked to Joe, and then he seems pretty content releasing his solo stuff, and he's in
Yeah,
a good place with that. So, I mean, I guess you know, in terms of their career, they've done it all with Blue Oyster Cult, and you know, maybe they're just onto a new thing now, and that's just
yeah,
the way it is.
yeah.
But
And you know, the Blue Oyster Cult is still got that fundamental person, Buck Dharma, and the
right,
guitar player right in the center. And that guy, he's just one of my favorite ever guitar players. You know, he just brings a something different to it.
yeah,
And Eric Bloom, the singer, is still in there.
yeah,
Um,
that's true, that's true. I was thinking now, you know, in Loudmouth, when you transition into the Cream magazine era of Thomas Ransom's character now, like, you know, of course, that's when, as a reader, we first meet Lester Bangs, and of
yeah,
course, there's also an element of truth to a lot of, you know, your interactions there because I mean, you know, having watched the Cream documentary, which just came out recently, like
yeah,
you tell that story of finding Lester
yeah,
there as well.
yeah,
Now, I guess my curiosity as a fan is, you know, thinking about Almost Famous, which is Cameron Crowe's
sure.
probably his, you know, tribute to his rock journalist years. I mean, how accurately does Philip Seymour Hoffman portray Lester, knowing that you knew him personally? I'm sure you get this question a lot, but
No, I don't. Oh, maybe I do. I don't know. I haven't had it in a while, and I thought Phillips. First of all, I love Philip Seymour Hoffman. I'm so
right.
sorry he's gone.
Yeah, it's
Um,
unfortunate.
but I thought he was really good at it. You know, um, so I thought he was great. You know, I thought, okay, he's been watching what the little footage that there is of Lester.
Yeah,
Yeah, he had it, and he kind of had a little bit of the same, you know, body type and as Lester. So the whole thing, he carried it off really well, I thought.
that's
So,
awesome. That's
and
awesome.
he was, you know, yeah, that was Lester for sure.
I always, even though I'm, you know, pushing 50 at this point, geez, I said it out loud, but
Oh
I
my
mean,
God,
like, I I oftentimes when I get with rock stars, you know, just to do any kind of journalism, or I'm invited
yeah,
backstage, or I spend those few brief moments in their world, I always feel like that kid from Almost Famous, even though I'm, like I said, in my mid 40s. It's kind of like you can, you know, get that shine from those guys for that brief moment in time, but you can never be nearly as cool as them because they're in it and they're doing their thing, and you know, that's just the way it is. And I think actually in Loudmouth, maybe there you mentioned that somewhere about how you'll never be as cool as those guys.
yeah. Well, yeah, I still get a kick out of meeting musicians. I play music and I write songs, and I'm just still fascinated by the whole thing. And I like I have some, you know, famous musician friends, and so yes, I still enjoy that. I still enjoy getting to know, you know, over the last few years, I happened to get I had a mutual friends with the Courtney Taylor from the Dandy Warhols, and so we became great friends. And you know, it's really not based on the music. I like his music, but it's not based on that. It's just based on, you know, we became friends. So I like that. And oh, when I was younger, I loved it. Although, um, in the spirit of Cream, and this was just something I had inside me. I like to tease rock stars. I didn't like to go in there and reveal my inner devotion. I would go in there and give them a bunch of shit. And it's the same kind of thing that Lester would do. I mean, Lester would just go take it to the nth degree. But I remember when I went to, I guess I had met the Kiss guys. I had interviewed them very early in their career, and but I went to out in San Francisco, and I went but I went to a press party in New York for one of their early records. I don't remember which one it was, but they had it in a building in Queens, New York, at the outer borough of Queens. And it was in an old-fashioned pool building, public pool building. It was a really nice kind of, retro building, but it was actually historical, and which was, think about it, that's just kind of a weird thing, but it was cool. And I remember I was, Gene came over and I was talking to Gene, and I said, dude, what the hell? You're so tall and you're wearing your platforms. I said, it doesn't seem, I'm not short, but I said, it doesn't seem fair to the rest of us normal mortals. So I went and got a chair and I stood on the chair and I said, I will talk to you from here. Why, see how it feels, Gene. So that was always my attitude, was to tweak them and tease them and sometimes torture them. And the ones that were truly cool, I think, liked it. I think Gene thought it was kind of funny. And I'm sure there's others out there who hated it, but the truly cool ones would take it well and enjoy it, and you might even develop a friendship out of that.
Yeah.
So I'm doing in October, the band The Hold Steady.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm doing a launch event, a virtual launch event in cooperation with a big bookstore in New York, big hipster bookstore called Green Light, but with Craig Finn of The Hold Steady, the songwriter and singer who I love. I love that band. I love him, and he's going to interview me about the book and virtually. And I'm doing another one on the West Coast with, do you know the experimental musician Gary Wilson? Anyways, Gary's going to do one out here. We're going to do the same thing out here, similar thing. Gary's a guy I really admire, and he's a true nut, but he's a great nut. And we have a design and advertising company I have with a bunch of partners, and we for a while we still do. It's just kind of a little bit asleep, is we have a record label, and we put out a Gary Wilson record at one point. So Gary and I became great friends.
Yeah.
So I like meeting rock stars. I like knowing rock stars. I'm not awed by rock stars, or at least I would never let them know. And I'm very suspicious of it. In the book, in Loudmouth, it talks about this whole relationship with Bruce Springsteen, where I was, he invited me down to his place on the shore, and we were really kind of working up a friendship. And I was like, there were various reasons, but I was always like, really? Why would this guy want to talk to me? He's like a big shot.
Yeah.
So maybe I was too insecure to be friends with really famous people.
There's a bit of a reciprocal thing between journalists and musicians, and sometimes you wonder if the second you give a musician what they want from you, if they'll even care,
right?
The very next day, right? Like, I mean, in my very short career doing this, I've felt like, oh, hey, I really resonated and got along with this guy, and then it's like the next day you wouldn't even have known that we even had a conversation, right? Apart from it maybe resonating throughout the extended internet press. But
yeah, I mean, that's what I always fear. I always think, well, he's just talking to me for this reason. But I remember I had a really good conversation one time with Joe Perry. This is only a few years ago.
Oh, wow.
And we were doing an interview. It was for some video thing, and we got to talking about some of the stuff that's in that Loudmouth book, childhood stuff, first discovering rock and roll. I talk about I can't remember if I talk about in the book, the Murray the K reviews, which were kind of the old-fashioned rock and roll package shows where you'd go to a movie theater and 20 bands would play, and they do 3 sets a day, and the bands were like, now it's like, it's a pantheon. It's like, Sam and Dave and the Who and just crazy stuff. But I remember we got to talking about that, Joe Perry and I, and the publicist stepped in and said, all right, that's it. Joe's got to go on. And Joe said, I make the rules, keep talking. So we just got along fabulously. So,
I was
so
just
that,
watching them in Decline of Western Civilization, the Metal Years, just a
yeah,
couple of weeks ago. And man, do those guys look like and talk like they've just been through a ringer. And at that point, it's maybe 1988, but they seem like they've sort of transitioned into that elder statesman kind of approach where rock and roll is still kind of fun for them, but it seems like it's a business at the same time. And they've,
oh yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, I don't
Well,
know
that
if
was
you've
after the
seen.
comeback when
Yeah, that's right.
they had lost all their money, and I mean, as I understand it, lost all their money, or just snorted it up their noses, and and they made that effort to come back. And I remember hearing that Aerosmith had a new album after many years, and I thought, yeah, well, whatever. And and it was, what did it have? Janie Got a Gun, and it had all Love in an Elevator, and it was like, it was actually a really good album. It was really slick, but so I give them credit for that. I interviewed them once at the height of their 70s uh, fame, and they were staying in the Plaza Hotel, and I interviewed Joe and Steven, and they were so high, and it was so hard to get through to them. It was one of the most boring interviews I've ever done, because it was like they were just like they just weren't fully there. They weren't hardly there. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
So you could see that they were headed for problems.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, now, selfishly, I guess, as a longtime journalist, I guess a question that I probably owe it to myself to pose is just, what advice you have for aspiring writers. I mean, I've only actually been writing rock and roll reviews and articles for a couple of years. I've been mostly doing interviews for, pushing 9 years now, and doing the audio thing. So, I
Yeah.
mean, I have noticed that I've sort of developed my own voice and style, but there's also a certain, you know, floweriness to words, and sometimes you even invent your own little phrases that are kind of uniquely you. But I mean, what's your advice in terms of just developing as a writer?
You know, uh, Developing as a writer is just about writing all the time, and the more you write, the better you get, and you understand what you're doing, and But that said, having written for, like, I don't know, 40 years, I still suffer the very similar bouts of insecurity, and insecurity is your biggest enemy. You're thinking, oh, this sucks, and you'll stop writing whatever it is. And I always approached rock writing as kind of a creative endeavor. So creative nonfiction, they'll call it these days. But I wanted to be this novelist. So I'm always trying to kind of work in the fantastical elements and the novelistic stuff. But, if you're compelled to write, that probably means you are a writer. But just start writing, and just write all the time. And at a certain, well, at any age, it's great to be reading a lot. Um, I mean, I've had bouts of insecurity where I go back and I read a bunch of stuff. I read some new books, and I'm like, oh, yeah, you can do it that way. You don't have to. It'll it'll allay your fear. You think, oh, this is just a weird way to structure something, and then you read a book and you're like, oh no, that person did this weird structure and that worked, and blah blah blah. Yeah, so I mean, it's just nothing. It's rudimentary uh, advice, but you write all the damn time and read all the damn time, and stay out of bars. Uh, no, I spent a lot of time in bars, so I didn't read as much as I should have. Fortunately, I got these early jobs, and at some point I had to write to make a living. And that was great training, And working at Cream was great training, because we had hard deadlines, and then you had the example of Lester Bangs, who was a brilliant writer, really just 1 in 1 million or 1 in 50 million type person who was, that could be very intimidating too, but it was also instructive. And I edited his copy sometimes. I was a managing editor, so all the copy went through me at some point. And so that was very instructive. It would be like, damn, Lester, he could give me 100-page manuscript, because he would just go off for days. And I'd say, if you cut this 20 pages out and this 20 pages, you would have gold. There was always gold buried in all that shit. Uh, and, but,
I love some of those early Cream reviews, like in the documentary, I think at one point they show a review and all it is the word "no" written like 50 times or
right,
something. I
right.
forget whose record it was, but
Oh,
was
it was Lou Reed's Metal Machine Music, I
right,
believe. And
yeah,
it's kind of the way I felt about it. If you've never listened to it, well, don't bother, but I'll describe it to you, because it's just kind of feedback. It is feedback, but it sounds like, it doesn't really, it just sounds like feedback, but not cool feedback. Okay, maybe you should listen to it. I don't know if it's on Spotify.
yeah, I'm sure it
but
can be found somewhere.
but yeah, it was a review of that, and that's the way I kind of felt about it. But Lester, who had he was just wired different. He would come in and put the damn thing on the record player in the editorial department, and listen to it. I mean, he would, or put it on while he was working, and you're there. Lester was older than me, and I had a lot more experience, and so far be it from me to say, will you turn that shit off? I'm trying to work. So you got to be cool. You
Yeah,
got to be cool. So that was what that was a review of
yeah.
Lou Reed.
Yeah, some of the stuff, oh my God, like there's no way in the PC, almost, dare I use the term cancel culture society, there's no way Cream could have possibly existed in that form, with some of the language and almost like brutally misogynistic stuff that reeled through there at any given time.
Yeah, I think, Jan Uhelski talks about that. I talk about that in the documentary too. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, no doubt there was stuff that was wrong at the time, and we understand better that it was wrong now. And Joan Jett is in there talking about that review where Rick Johnson called them bitches, and so it's stuff that we wouldn't do today. But I think that a magazine, given the right ingredients of people, uh, I think a magazine like that could happen today. But people today would know, yeah, we don't go into that direction. Part of the whole point of Cream was to, you know, poke people and annoy people and tease people and poke at the culture and make fun of Rolling Stone by calling yourself America's only rock and roll magazine. Um, so
Yeah.
I think you could do it, and it might be a better magazine because it wouldn't have all that shit in it. So
That's fair.
I
It's
mean, I'm in
unfortunate.
favor of not being misogynist
Yeah.
and it wasn't racist really, but yeah.
Sadly, growing up through the 80s rock and roll, I only remember Circus and Hit Parade, or I don't
Yeah.
remember Cream, but I think at the point, when Cream rolled into the 80s, a lot of those original people were long gone. Like I think Barry had maybe passed away, or at least
Yeah, he did.
sold a
He was gone,
portion of
yeah.
it or whatever. I'm trying to remember the documentary. I watched it very late last night, but
Yeah, Lester died about 80. I think he died in 83. And Barry died maybe 81. I
yeah.
remember getting the phone call about, I think Lester didn't have a phone at that point. He didn't have a phone for a time because he didn't pay his bills. And I remember getting the call. We lived next door to each other in New York.
Hmm.
And I got the call about Barry Kramer dying and going over there. And Lester and Barry, who was the publisher, and really you realize, and you look at the documentary, they've been very fair to him, and he was, pretty essential to keeping the thing, paychecks coming and all that. Uh, and creating a bubble for these personalities that were writing there, and not getting in their way at all. Every once in a while he'd make some effort. He'd say, "Can't do you really got to do this?" And it would be like, "Yeah, fuck off, Barry." And so he would. He wasn't a wimp, but he would go away.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, I've lost my train here.
Cream in the 80s.
Cream in the 80s, yes. So he was gone, Lester was gone. It got sold to another guy, and they took it to LA, and it was like, it just wasn't the same.
Yeah.
So, and then it just kind of fizzled out. So
yeah, I was talking to David Clayton Thomas of
sure.
Blood,
Blood,
Sweat, and
Sweat, and
Tears
Tears.
fame, and he blamed the collapse of the music industry to it moving to LA of all things. And there was, a bit of a diatribe explaining the glitz and the, quote unquote glam of LA, and the, the Hollywood aspect of LA kind of made music superfluous. But I mean, like, is that sort of what maybe why you could characterize a lot of that 80s glam metal as being as ridiculous as Penelope Spheris made it look?
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely an LA/Hollywood phenomenon. I mean, you know, uh, and people, I like LA, but but it's such a cliche to say it's shallow, and it's it's just money obsessed and this. So I won't go there, but it did seem like those bands were about makeup and wigs and all the kinds of things that happen in movies, and 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 of course cocaine too. That was the era when cocaine ruled Hollywood. You would go down there and it would be like, damn, dudes, they would just be, everybody would be hoovering up blow. So,
Yikes.
um,
But I mean, you were in San Francisco, so you must have seen the rise of the Bay Area scene to a certain extent. I know metal's not necessarily your cup of tea, but you must have been in that a little bit as a journalist, seeing as you were from the same town.
well, I spent most of my life in New York. So I was born in Wisconsin, but I went to, and lived around a lot. We moved around when I was a kid, as does Thomas Ransom in Loudmouth. And, but we wound up in New York, and I spent 25 years of my growing up in New York. And so I was more New York, and then I went to Detroit. I mean, again, I moved around a little bit. I went to San Francisco, came back to New York, went to San Francisco, but I didn't really move to San Francisco permanently till the mid '80s, and that's just where I am now. I'm outside San Francisco, and so I saw Metallica a little bit, and I would see Metallica. I would see the guys driving around in their cars in the neighborhood. So, so the Bay Area metal scene, and by that time I had a couple kids, and it was like, all right, when your kids are young, you're kind of gotta just, there ain't a lot of going out to
That's fair, yeah.
go crazy in shows. So I have a missing chunk of my life, which like kind of the mid '80s to mid '90s, late '90s, when my kids were growing up. So, and now they're grown. They're way grown. My son was he was a Russian major in college,
Oh,
and
wow.
wound up going to he wound up going to Russia, for living in Russia for 9 years, and he became when he was very young, it reminded me of me when he's very young, except not in Russian, and he became the publisher of Vice Media, the magazine and all the video stuff in Russia. So he was
Wow.
the Vice guy in Russia for a few years, and that was kind of cool. But that's
Yeah,
beside
well, your generation now, I mean, you're the baby boomer generation. I'm Generation X. we're seeing the collapse of what baby boomers work so hard to build now. Why hasn't, I don't want to claim to speak for Generation X, but why is there a big missing chunk of my generation not rising up maybe and taking the mantle of leadership? And why is there so much okay boomer back and forth between millennials and Gen Z and boomers, like it
Yeah.
seems like an odd phenomenon to me. Like my generation seems to have just taken our ball and went home.
you know, I hate talking about. I don't believe. It's like not all of LA is Hollywood, and I
Mm.
don't believe these generations are all so monolithic as people like to make them out to be. I think it's an easy way to just, it's just an easy premise for whether you're writing or making a documentary or whatever. And it's I just feel it's like a cheap shot. I know wonderful people. I don't even know which generation is which. And I know wonderful people from every generation. I have young friends, and I have friends that are, most of my friends now are younger than me. But so I don't know. I don't know that that's the case. I haven't studied the Gen X, or I haven't studied them, because I don't think that's the frame we should be looking at. I see out there in the culture, I see a lively culture full of great music, and great books are still coming out. And there's all sorts of, I don't pay any attention to gaming, but there's all sorts of interesting things going on in the gaming world, and bad stuff. And there's lots of, and it always was 90% shit. Most culture is crap, and done to be exploitive. But there's still wonderful stuff. I have no, it seems like it was a wonderful time in the 60s with all those British invasion bands, but I think it's a wonderful time now. And I think all this bedroom pop that we hear, and people doing it themselves, for real this time, doing it themselves, making it and distributing it themselves, is, this may be looked on as the next Renaissance. So I don't know. I don't accept the premise of generations, and all these people doing the okay boomer stuff. It's like, whatever,
Yeah.
and the stuff that the idea that the stuff that the boomers did is going away. I don't buy that either. It's like you should have seen the world in the 1950s. It was really, and boomers didn't build it. I had a much older brother, and he was like a hot rod gangster guy, and there's a character based on him in Loudmouth. But we're just all building on one another. And Ed Ward, the guy who gave me my start in music writing, he wrote a history of rock and roll, and it goes back to 1920. And so, and a guy like Andy Warhol was older at the time, when, in the 60s. And there was plenty of old people that were leading the way. And I mean, look at Bernie Sanders, in the States. Bernie, he's what, I don't know. What is he? Is he 80 yet? No, he's pushing. He looks like he's 80.
I think
He's
he's
pushing
older
80.
than President Trump, but
Yeah.
maybe
And
about 3 or 4
so
years.
there's an old guy that the kids love him. He's so popular among young people in the States. So,
Yeah.
so I'm I'm on a mission to destroy the generational frame for social criticism.
That's fair. Well, listen, I should let you go here, but the book is called Loudmouth, and it's coming out October 6th. I have the publishing
October
information
6th,
here.
yes. But you can pre-order it now, stoners.
That's right. That's right. And of course, you said now you're working on an audio version of that too. So I mean, you're just on the final stretch of that. So I mean, when can we expect that? Do you
That's
have a
coming
definitive
October
release
6th.
date? That is
Oh,
also
yeah.
October 6th.
Yeah.
Nice, nice. Well, it's a lot to look
Audio,
forward to.
ebook, and the print on October 6th. And
Nice.
but you can order the print one, pre-order it now, and you'll be able to pre-order the audio book if I ever finish the goddamn thing. I have a studio, so I think, hey, what the hell? I'll just edit it myself, and
There you go.
that was an error.
Nice backdrop, by the way. You got the book right in behind you. Very well done. I
Well,
actually I do put a little bit of thought into the vinyl that's in the back. I put the Springsteen, the River vinyl in the back
oh, I see it. Yeah,
just for
yeah,
you. So there you go.
yeah. Well, thank you. Yes. Um, yeah, I had a music stand, and I thought, I ought to dress this place up. I mean, it's more or less the way it looks normally, but
Yeah.
I had a music stand, and then I had my microphone in because I have to every once in a while record a patch for. I'm reading the audiobook, so I have to record a patch for it or something. And I thought, oh, that
Right.
looks kind of cool. And then I stole my wife's gold record. She designed a Blue Oyster Cult album, and
Awesome.
Spectre is the one with Godzilla on it.
Oh, geez. Yeah, I need to get more Blue Oyster Cult vinyl. I have the debut, the self-titled, but I know I need to get a couple more Agents of Fortune, of course. And
Yeah,
I love
yeah,
Blue Oyster Cult. I adore that group,
yeah,
and I'm a longtime Black Sabbath and Kiss fan, but
yeah,
I mean, there's something about Blue Oyster Cult that just, it resonates for me. It's dark and psychedelic and trippy and weird, and all of that, interesting stuff that happened was going down in the '70s, music wise.
yeah.
Seems to
I
be
could tell you
all.
more about that. But in fact, the guy there, they're kind of Svengali and co-songwriter and producer and manager Sandy Pearlman spent the last. He passed a few years ago.
Mhm.
We were very close. He lived with us for a while, and we became his guardians after he had his cerebral hemorrhage, and but he taught at McGill for many years in
Wow.
oh, and then he was at the University of Toronto, so he was a an adopted countryman to you.
Well, listen, man, we'll have to do this again. I've really
Yeah,
enjoyed just chatting with you, man. It's been a true
me
privilege and an
too.
honor here on Do You Know Jack today. I was looking forward to this the last couple of days, and I'm glad we were able to chat for as long as we have.
Well, I was too. I hope we didn't go too long, and yeah, keep in touch. Keep in touch. I enjoyed it.
Right on. Well, you have a good day, sir.
All right, Jack.
Bye bye.